خير الأولين والآخرين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن وذكر الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا. اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. اللهم أصلح لنا شأننا كله، لا إله إلا أنت، نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Alhamdulillah, it's really an honor to be here. I really appreciate the invitation. MashaAllah, you're a new organization for me nationally. I was unaware that you did work here in the Bay Area, so it really is a pleasure to be invited to speak about this important topic. I wanted to begin by firstly speaking about the fact that today, Friday, is the last day of what we call Black History Month. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that prior to starting this particular lecture. Black History Month actually started off as Black History Week. The founder of Black History Week was a man known as Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was born in 1857, died in 1950. Dr. Carter G. Woodson was the second African-American who received a PhD from Harvard University. And the first was a man known as W.E.B. Du Bois. But while he was the second to obtain a PhD from Harvard, he was actually the very first child of former slaves to do so. Like his parents actually were slaves. So Carter G. Woodson has, he has many different works and books that he has written, and his most popular book is known as The Miseducation of the Negro. Now, Mr. Woodson, he believed that a remedy, the main and most important remedy to racism in America had to do with proper education. And part of that entailed including the African or the Black experience as part of American history. And of course, the other element of that was more interaction, more positive interaction, and the more people mixed together with one another and they became more familiar with one another, he believed that this itself would lead to a better society. Now, Black History Month did not become Black History Month until the 1970s in the United States. And around like the year 1976 was when the very first president started to declare it to be a national holiday. So this quite often people take issue with the fact that Black History Month happens during the shortest month of the year. And they say, well, that in itself is racist. But what people don't understand about this is that Dr. Woodson, his original intent was for it to be Black History Week, and he scheduled it during the second week of February, which was intended to coincide with the birthday of President Abraham Lincoln, and also the slave abolitionist Frederick Douglass. So former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. So in that sense, he was honoring both a Black and a white person by celebrating Black History Month. And of course, the most popular president of the time, who actually gave his life after emancipating the slaves. And so the Blacks at that time, they had clearly had a love for Abraham Lincoln because of that. And then Frederick Douglass himself, who was actually part of Lincoln's cabinet, or rather, at least who was definitely someone who was very close to the president. He, alongside one of his friends, Dr. Martin Delany, who himself was an army physician. And it was interesting about the two of them was that Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, they were very, very good friends. Is that they became sort of archetypes or sort of the representatives of two different paradigms in the Black American community. So for instance, Frederick Douglass he he believed that America is where we belong. We are Americans, right? And we need to remain here and of course struggle through our plight, our challenges, to until we actually gain equality. Dr. Delaney, on the other hand, was a sort of we call a nationalist, or he wanted to go back to Africa. He felt that America would never accept Black people in American society, and so therefore we should go back to Africa, right? And so these two sort of paradigms continue to exist among the African Americans or the Black Americans today. And so I just wanted to offer a little bit of context before we start the fundamental questions of what it means to be Black. Now, there's an incident which is mentioned in the Sirah, which relates to the conquest of Mecca. And during that particular day, after the Prophet ﷺ had secured victory, and many of the chieftains of Mecca had become Muslim on that day, he had asked Bilal ibn Rabah, radiallahu anhu, who we know to be the most popular Black Sahabi. He asked him to alight upon the Kaaba, and he wanted him to do a summons to gather the people because the Prophet wanted to make a speech. Now, when Bilal was climbing the Kaaba, three or four of the people, these chieftains who had just become Muslim, Harith ibn Hisham, it was Suhail ibn Amr, Atab ibn Asid, and some narrations include Abu Sufyan, that they saw Bilal climbing the Kaaba, and they were just really horrified, by what they saw, right? And so one of them said, according to the tafsir, well, I'm glad my father's not alive to see this. Another said, if Allah wants good, He'll change this. And then another is reported to have said, did Muhammad, alayhi salatu wasalam, did he have any, could he not choose anyone other than this black crow to call the adhan, to make the summons? Right? So word reached the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and so then he had, of course, decided to do a different speech, perhaps, than he originally had planned. Right? So during this speech, which is recorded, supposedly is reported to have said, "Ayyuhan nas, inna Allah qad adhhaba ankum ubiyata jahiliyati wa ta'adhumuha bi abaiha." So, oh people, Allah, He has rid you of the vainglory of the Jahili days and your aggrandizement of your forefathers, or their aggrandizement of their forefathers, because naturally they say, well, I'm so great because of who my dad was, right? And so then he goes on and says, فَالنَّاسُ رَجُلَانِ, people are only one of two types. رَجُلٌ بَرٌ تَقِيٌّ كَرِيمٌ عَلَى اللَّهِ, one is a pious, upright, a person who is of value to God. وَفَاجِرٌ شَقِيٌّ هَيِّنٌ عَلَى اللَّهِ, and the other is a wicked wretch who is insignificant in God's eyes. Then he says, when nasu min Adam wa khalaqa Allahu Adam min turab. People, all the people are from Adam, and Allah created Adam from dirt. And then it said that there was the occasion upon which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He revealed the verse, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakara wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uba wa qaba'ila li ta'arafu, inna akramakum inda Allahi atqakum, inna Allah alimun khabir. O humanity, O mankind, verily we created you from a male and female, and we made you into nations and into tribes, so that you would come to know one another. Verily the most noble of you in the sight of God are those who are most conscious of God. Verily Allah, He is all-knowing, He is well acquainted. So this very, this verse we have here in our book is an extremely important verse. It is a very special verse, and I remember years ago when I visited United Nations with my classmates from high school, that and I don't know if it's still the case, but usually, well, as soon as you come into the UN building, right on the right side, they used to have that verse posted there, right, in the UN building, right. So you walk into the UN building, and it would be nice if it's still there, So it's really there where actually some sense of like, okay, this is something special that Islam offers us, right? To add on top of this, we've had a number of personalities throughout our history, and I mean sort of human history, who have, of course, served as great exemplars, among both from the Muslim community, especially, because everybody, all the non-Muslims believe Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and Umar Mukhtar. There's so many great figures that Islam has produced, and because of this special creed and special ability of Muslims to practice what they preach, there are others who have noticed these things. So we know, of course, Malcolm X, rahimahullah, Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz, that one of the things he has said, once he himself had embraced the true teachings of Islam, and he had come back from Mecca, and during one of his interviews, he had made it clear that, after his experience in Mecca, that he had come to realize that that maybe if the white man, would accept Islam, then it would be a source of peace and harmony for the country and for everyone, right? And maybe this would change the problems that they had within themselves, right? Mahatma Gandhi as well had very positive things to say about Islam. Like if you read his writings, I remember reading something where he talked about when he was comparing Islam to Hinduism, which was his own religion, and he talked about two important values of Islam. Like one of the values was the value of monotheism, right, and the other one was brotherhood, right. So he is highlighting that, okay, yeah, well, as Hindus, we also have those values, in our religion, right? But the difference between us and the Muslims, and he's not even Muslim, he's speaking this way, and he says the difference between us and the Muslims is that the Muslims, when it comes to their monotheism, they have a pure monotheism. Ours is not so pure, right? But and also when it comes to brotherhood, he said they have a much more a more authentic brotherhood compared to us, right? Because he's in India, he's dealing with the caste system and things like that. You would think, okay, we're all follow the same religion. What does this caste system have to do with genuine brotherhood, right? So and an African American activist, philosopher, mystic known as Dr. Howard Thurman, who also, he was born in the 1800s, and he was very influential with respect to the civil rights movement in America. As a matter of fact, he even influenced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In his approach towards his nonviolent approach, towards trying to overcome racism and segregation in the United States. And so he was so much concerned with this particular approach because Gandhi had already been trying this in India, right? So he went and he tells a story in one of his books, this Dr. Howard Thurman, he tells a story of where he goes to India to visit Gandhi. And when he gets there, Gandhi asks him, like, okay, what religion do you follow? And so he tells Gandhi, I'm a Christian. Now, he wasn't a normal sort of Protestant or Catholic Christian. He was a Unitarian Universalist Christian, but he still identified as a Christian. And Gandhi, so Dr. Thurman is telling the story, and he said that, well, Gandhi found it strange that I wasn't a Muslim. And he said, well, why is that? Why is that strange? He said, well, because only the religion of Muhammad is the religion that actually treats all of his members equally, right? And then Dr. Thurman goes on to say, and Gandhi actually had a good point there, right? But of course, he still doesn't become Muslim. But it's really interesting that he tells a story in one of his books. I read it some years ago, and I was really surprised to find that. And so anyways, I just wanted to mention these things sort of for starters, and as we move forward. And so let's come back to Bilal ibn Rabah. So Bilal ibn Rabah, as we know, is the most popular of all of the black, we call it the black Sahaba, right? And so this idea of what it means to be black naturally, is a somewhat troublesome question, right? In the sense that we can think about black as a color, right? So it's like, some of us wear black, right? That's, nobody does it there, that is black, right? But then we think about black as a racial classification, right? A racial classification. And with racial classification comes certain assumptions, of course, right? That this is sort of the time we live in where we think about race, we think about it as sort of a biological fact in the sense that people who are a certain color, that they themselves, they bear not only the same look, but also the same ideas, the same proclivities, the same motivations, even, right? And so it is an important question, like where that even comes from. Like, why do you even think that way? We assume, because like, that's why it's often when we hear people, who are, they're not thinking in the way that they're supposed to, right? I don't know how it is in Turkey. When people say, "Oh, you don't sound like a Turk." I don't know if that happens. Perhaps it does. You don't sound Turkish to me. Because Turks don't think that way. I don't know, but I know that this is definitely something very common, right? In the West, where the old I don't know if you ever saw that interview with when Biden was running for office, and he was on the this guy's show. He calls himself Alhamdulillah, I'm glad I forgot his name, because he has the God in his name, but but he's on this show, and so he's talking to Biden about why should black people vote for him as opposed to Trump. And so Biden tells him, well, if you have trouble trying to decide whether or not you're for me or for Trump, then you ain't black. Right? So it's become sort of a meme now, so that you ain't black unless you vote Democrat. And that is somewhat of the attitude of perhaps even most black people, right? What we call black people today, even though blacks have always been non-monolithic, right? And our thinking, and even when we add on top of that, when there's more and more immigration coming from the African continent, and then you have the Caribbean blacks, and you have those who are born and raised here in the United States. Right there, you have three different types of blacks. You have the Caribbean, those who are indigenous to the United States, then you have those from the African continent, which of course itself is diverse too, right? So how do you talk about people, so many different people who are who come from different tribes and have different cultures, different ambitions, right? In one single way, right? So I wanted to just I think this PowerPoint's probably here. Okay, I found it. I don't know if that's going to affect the video. Should affect the video, yeah. Okay. Share screen. All right. I'll maybe share PowerPoint, perhaps. Maybe that might be better, because I'm not sure. Because if you share my screen, then they see. It's okay. They can see. Whoever's online, they could see this and that. You see this one. Okay. All right. It's on there. Okay. Okay. All right. So this, again, we've dealt with a couple of these things already, right? So I want to start here. So starting here, right? So what does it mean to be black? There's a hadith of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, found in Sahih Imam Muslim. And in this hadith, the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, he mentions 5 things that he was given that the other prophets were not given. And among the things he lists is that I've been sent to every red and black person. Now, what's really interesting here is that, and I've seen some imams make this mistake of taking the word red to mean what we typically understand it to mean in the English language. But the word red in the Arabic language was a term used for white people, right? Now, who did the Arabs consider to be white? The Arabs considered to be white generally, right? Some get 3 basic categories, because the Turks would be included, right? But generally, the whites were the Persians, the Romans, or rather the Byzantines, right, and the Syrians, right? Those from the Levant, right? The people of Sham, right? The people of Sham, people of Furs, and the people of Rome, right? So those who they considered to be white. So the Arabs were surrounded by 3 important, sort of empires. You had, of course, the Persian Empire, then the Byzantine Empire, and then in East Africa there was the Kingdom of Axum, right, as well, where we call the Abyssinians. So, so the Arabs didn't see themselves as a black race, but they also didn't see themselves as a white race, right? Now, the reason they called the whites reds was because the Arabs themselves, they considered um, it offensive to call someone white, or in other words, use the word abyad in the Arabic language, right? Unless you are utilizing it to refer to someone's character, So you can be abyad, which is the typical word we use for white, usually, when you're trying to say someone has good character, right? Hada rajul abyad, right? He has good character. But when they're trying to express it to mean that someone had white skin, they would say red, because the majority of the Arabs were light and dark brown. So when you were white, if you were white, what it meant was what you have was called baras. So baras is the Arabic term for vitiligo. Right? So we've seen people, of course, who lose their pigmentation. Right? So you have, some dark skin, and so you start to lose your pigmentation. Right? They consider that to be aib, or it's like it was something like offensive to refer to someone. It was like a derogatory. I was attacking you. You're abyad. What do you mean I'm abyad? What do you mean I'm white? Right? So it was very problematic. So themselves, so they didn't even want to refer to the people who are not Arabs as being white, right? Because that was just one of those things for them. It is okay. So when the Prophet talks about he was sent to the red, it means to the white, right? And sent to the black, it means the other people as well, right? So black itself becomes even a collectivist word, a word which encompasses, not only really sort of sub-Saharan black, right? Sub-Saharan, like for instance, those of East Africa, the Aksumite kingdom, think people like that, but also the Browns as well, right? And so then there's some disagreement about, okay, whether or not the Arabs are included under the blacks or under the whites. Right? So, but all the scholars, they, like for instance, Imam Nawawi, Ibn Athir, Ibn Mandur, these are sort of lexicographers, and Ibn Hafiz al-Dhahabi, for instance, the great Shafi'i hadith scholar, that when they speak of this hadith and they speak of the question of who the Arabs, what category they fall under, they all say that because most of the Arabs were brown people. They all say that they were brown people, right? Hafiz al-Dhahabi, he even goes as far as saying that, although the norm when you call someone abyad in the Arabic language, it means that you're speaking about their character. He said that on the rare occasion when you're speaking about their physical color, he actually says it means hinta lone. It means that you're weak colored, so you're not pale white, right? So a person is weak colored, right? So regardless of what classification, right, or what particular term the Prophet was including the Arabs under, what everyone agrees upon is that the Arabs were a majority brown people, right? That was the norm, right? To be, sort of inclined towards the sort of the more palish color, similar to the Syrians, et cetera, right? That in itself was odd. It was out of the ordinary for the Arabs. Now, here's a quote from Al-Jahiz. Jahiz was a very influential hyper-rationalist, we even would call him Mu'tazili scholar, right? Who actually, he was from East Africa himself, that he was African, right? I just want to make sure I can move this up. Okay, right. So he was East African. And his great many, valuable works, right? So this is what he said, and we commented on this hadith of the Prophet, Salaam, the Bible translation. He said, we already know that God, mighty and majestic, sent his prophet to all humanity, to the Arabs and non-Arabs. So when he says, I was sent to the red and the black, and we are neither red nor white in his view. So he's talking about he's talking about we, like his own people, the people of East Africa. He's East African, like from the area of like Zanzibar, Tanzania. So he's an East African himself, Imam Jahiz. He said, so when we are neither red nor white in his view, then he was sent to and was referring to us when he said the black. So he said the Prophet ﷺ was talking about us, like we Africans, right? When he said the black. He said people are classified under either one of these two designations, that is red, black, or red. So if the Arabs are part of the red species, they're counted among the Romans, the Slavs, the Persians, and those of Khurasan. So you see, like, this is very understand. Those are the white people. That's what they mean by the white people. So, but they're the red are the white people. Then he goes on and said, but if they, meaning the Arabs, are from the black, then he has extracted this designation from theirs. I'm sorry. Then he has extracted this designation of theirs from our own designation. In other words, in other words, the Prophet ﷺ included the Arabs under our sort of genus, right? So they're a subspecies of us, right? And then he goes on and says, and they were merely referred to as black in spite of being dark and light brown, right? So he said the Arabs were dark and light brown. So a fact that even, he knew, since they are included with us in our species, similar to how the Arabs subsumed females under the male collective in morphology, right? So we say a male, masculine, plural, it defaults to the woman too. So if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he uses the masculine plural, then we assume that it also applies to women unless otherwise, indicated that this is an exception. And since the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam knew that Negroes, Abyssinians, and Nubians are neither red nor white, being that they are black, and God sent him to the black and the red, he made us and the Arabs equal in color, while we are truly those who are black, not them. So in other words, the Arabs are not black. We're really black, but the Prophet ﷺ included them under our category. So if the term black is applied to us, we are the pure blacks, while the Arabs are the quasi-blacks. So we are the first to whom the invitation was presented. Okay. So this is jahaz, right? It's an important thing to highlight here, because later on when we talk about the question of whether or not it is appropriate to say things like, the Prophet was white or the Prophet was black, it's important to reflect upon. It's an important point of reflection. We take this into consideration. Now, when we talk about the Arabs, there's the tendency today, especially, to imagine that a black Arab is the anomaly rather than the default. Now, if we say that the Arabs are black Arabians, right? The blacks among the Arabs today are black Arabians, then that itself gives the impression that, okay, well, most Arabs are not black or not brown, right? But when we say they're Arabian blacks, that's sort of, again, similar to what Jahaz is pointing out here. He say, okay, well, the Prophet placed them under our category, or at least if you interpret it that way, because he said that, it's not clear. Is he saying that they're from the red or they're from the black, right? But we do know that most of them are brown. He said we know that much, right? But we just don't know for sure what particular category the Prophet was including the Arabs under. So there's a well-established fact that the Arabs during the time of the revelation, and then for much of Islamic history, that this was the norm. So the original Arabs were the Arabs of Arabia, which means that everyone outside of Arabia become Arabized, right? Or Arabicized people. That they're people they were called the Musa'riba, that they became they were accepted into Arabness, right? So, and this is the thing that's interesting about the difference between whiteness and Arabness, right? Because we can talk about, okay, well, hey, that you can't become white, right? No matter how much you try, but you could become Arab, right? Now, how you're able to become Arab? You become Arab through acculturation, through learning the language. When the language becomes your mother tongue, that when you have a relative who originates from Arabia. I mean, so Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, he talked about how, like, the elements of true Arabness are that, one, that you originate from Arabia, right? Two, that your father is Arab, and 3, that you speak the Arabic language. Those are his conditions, right? So even if you don't live in the Arabian Peninsula anymore, but if your roots go back to there, then you're an authentic Arab. But he even takes it further. He says, okay, well, you have to preserve the language. If you lose a connection with the language, you're no longer an Arab, right? So regardless of whether or not your parents originated from Arabia, that was his opinion, right? So there's a hadith which, inshallah, I'll talk about it later. I'll leave it for now, And so, but he has some comments on that particular hadith. Now, to show you again how this works, and that how the claim of blackness, or brownness rather, right? Because black is not, brown is not really black, right? We know that, right? But it's just simply a word, right? It's a convenient word to encapsulate or to include a lot of people of darker skin underneath, right? But Bilal ibn Rabah, for instance, we talk about Bilal, and people today have the tendency to say that, okay, the reason that Bilal ibn Rabah radiallahu an was persecuted was because of his black skin. But there's really not strong evidence for that was the reason. It wasn't because of his black skin. Bilal ibn Rabah was persecuted because he was an outsider, period, right? In the sense that tribalism was the main feature of acceptance, right, and rejection, right? So if you are a member of one of the Arab tribes, especially in the Hijaz, then you are, authentically one of us. If you come elsewhere, then you're not going to really have the same level of influence or protection. Like example of this is Ammar ibn Yasir. Ammar ibn Yasir, radiallahu an, whose father, right, was from Yemen, and his mother was from Abyssinia, Sumayya bin Khuyyat. And Sumayya was the first martyr of Islam, right? She was killed by Abu Jahl, very gruesome fashion, unfortunately, rahimahullah. But this was his mother, Sumayya, right? His father, Yasser, right, was an authentic Arab, and he was from Yemen. Nobody questioned his Arabness, but they were still persecuted. Why were they persecuted? Because they didn't have a tribe in the north, right, who was there, who could protect them, right? All their protection was still in Yemen, So what happened is the way that they found their way up to the north was that Ammar's father, Yasser, had a brother, right, who was missing. And so he and 2 of his brothers had come up to Hijaz looking for him. The two brothers, they decided after a certain period of time, when they couldn't locate him, to return. They went back. But Yasser decided to remain. But now remaining meant that he needed some tribal connection and protection. So he became, a client of one of the tribes in Mecca, and he would serve him. And Sumayya was a slave woman to working for that same tribe. And so eventually he married Sumayya, right? And then she was set free. Ammar was set free along with her. But Ammar bin Yasir is described as being a man with extremely dark skin. And when you look at the description, you actually say, okay, well, I don't see much difference between him and Bilal. In the description, you look at Bilal's description, they say, what color is Bilal? He was Adam Shadidul Udma, right? Which means he was extremely dark brown, right? You look at Ammar bin Yasir, same description. You look at Abu Dhar al-Ghifari, same description. Right? You find description of Osama bin Zayd, similar. Zayd ibn Haritha, as a matter of fact, even though there are different narrations about Zayd ibn Haritha, some narrations say he was very light-skinned, but others say he was very dark-skinned. Ibn Sa'd, in his Tabaqat, he actually relates a narration from Muhammad al-Baqir, right? That Ali ibn Abi Talib was Adam Shadid al-Udma, that he was extremely dark black as well. So you have, multiple narrations to show like these great Sahaba, right? The 10 sons of Abdul Muttalib, and among them the father of the Prophet Abdullah, as well, right, are described as extremely dark, right? All of them are ascribed that way. Jahiz mentions it. You can find it in Abdurrahman Suyuti's book, Rafu Shatn al-Habshan, same thing with Abdurrahman al-Munjozi. They mentioned the same things about the sons of Abdul Muttalib, Thabit ibn Qais. I mean, there are a number of them, right? So how can it be, right? Ammar ibn Yasir, he's persecuted. Suhaib al-Rumi. Now, Suhaib al-Rumi, we have the tendency to believe that Suhaib was not Arab because his Rumi after his name. But Suhaib was Arab. He was ethnically an Arab. His parents were from Arabia. And see what happened. What happened was that when he was a little boy, say his father and uncle used to work for the Persian Empire on the outskirts of Arabia, close to the Byzantine Empire. And there was a raid. And in that raid, Suhaib was kidnapped and then turned into a slave and taken to Rome. So when later on he returned to Arabia, and he accepted the Prophet's message, they referred to him as Suhaib al-Rumi. Now, Suhaib, because he spent so much time in Rome, that while he was still able to understand Arabic, he struggled to speak it. So his dialect, his accent was a very strong accent, right, when he spoke. Right. As a matter of fact, there's a story where Umar ibn Khattab and one of his slaves, Aslam, Abu Zayd, were visiting Suhaib al-Rumi at his estate in Mecca. And or Medina, I'm sorry. What I believe is Medina, right? So he's visiting his estate, right? So they're visiting. Suhaib sees them coming from afar, and he starts to scream out, "Ya Nas, Ya Nas, Ya Nas!" And Umar ibn Khattab is baffled because he said, "Well, the Arabs, we don't speak this way. What does he mean, Ya Nas? Ya Nas means, oh people, oh people." It's like, well, why is he calling for the people? What is he doing that for? But Aslam understood. He said, no. He's not calling, oh people. He's saying, Yohannas, 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 which is the name of his servant, right? So he found it difficult to say or to speak the Arabic language. And during that particular visit, Umar ibn Khattab, according to this report, actually, he questioned Suhaib. He said, why, I don't get it. Why do you keep attributing yourself to the Arabs? But then Suhaib starts to explain to him, okay, well, this is my story. I am Arab. What do you mean? I am Arab. My father, and then I was kidnapped. And so this is what happens, right? So it was also interesting about this when we compare him to Bilal ibn Rabah, is that Bilal, despite being from Abyssinia, at least his roots go back to Abyssinia, that there is no indication that Bilal ibn Rabah had an accent. Now, there is a fabricated story, as a hadith is fabricated, where it says that when Bilal ibn Rabah, when he called the adhan, that because of his accent, he found it difficult to say sheen. So when he would say, ashhadu an la, he would say, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Right? And so according to this hadith, the Prophet supposedly said, inna sina Bilal sheenun indallah, that the sin of Bilal is a sheen in the sight of God, right? But multiple scholars of hadith have declared this hadith fabricated. Even Ibn Kathir in his Bidayah wa Nihaya goes as far as saying that this hadith is in addition to the fact that Bilal himself was very magnanimous, that Bilal himself had a very beautiful voice. He was very eloquent in Arabic language. I mean, Bilal has his own poetry. Yeah, he has his own poetry. So I mean, there's no reason to believe that Bilal could not speak Arabic eloquently, especially considering that he was born in Arabia. He was born and raised in Arabia. I mean, one report says he was born in Sarat, which is in the east, and then some say he was in Mecca. Right. So in other words, he'd never been in Africa. He was never in Africa. Right. So what we know children when they grow up, right, in a particular society. Right. So Bilal himself, his mother definitely was a slave. There's little information we have about his father, but also is reported to have been a slave. Right. So in other words, so him being persecuted clearly had much more to do with him being an outsider than him being black or having black skin. Right. So this is an extremely important point. again, so this is something I talked about before, the issue of Arabization. So fundamentally, if we say that the true Arabs are those of Arabia, then that means that pretty much all the Arabs today, not all of them, but most of them outside of Arabia, those from outside of Arabia are Arabized people, right? So people again, the Palestinians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Moroccans, outside of Arabia, so that they're, especially those who actually we call the white skinned Arabs, people of the Baydan, right, among them. So that needs to be understood clearly as well. Now, this is a hadith which scholars declare this to be a weak hadith, but this is a hadith روي عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال إن الرب واحد والدين واحد والأب واحد. Now, the occasion is said that the occasion when the Prophet made these statements was that he was having a meeting with the Sahaba. And Suhaib al-Rumi was there. Salman al-Farisi was there. Bilal ibn Rabah was there as well. And some of the Sahaba, some of them, supposedly, they said, Ya Rasulullah, nahnu Arab, we're the Arab. Why are they here? Why are they here? Right. So then the Prophet, according to that narration, goes on to say, the Lord is one, the religion is one, and the Father is one. Arabic, however, is neither a father nor a mother. Rather, it is nothing more than the language, so whoever speaks Arabic is an Arab. Okay. So in other words, to say that, okay, well, despite the fact, that they are not, of course, part of our lineage, our bloodline, they still are, they speak Arabic, right? Now, again, the hadith itself has been declared to be weak, not fabricated, but declared to be very, very weak. Ibn Taymiyyah, he relates this hadith, he acknowledges that this is a weak hadith. He said, despite of it being weak, it articulates what actually happened, right, in Islamic history. In other words, that most of the people, he was saying during his time, he was talking about people outside of Arabia who were now Arabs, became Arabs this way through the adoption of the language. So that's actually what happened. So even if we said the Prophet didn't say, this is exactly what happened. So they were incorporated into the Arab race through their adoption of the language. Now, there's a book that I wrote called The Negro and Arab Muslim Consciousness. And one of the fundamental areas of study that I was undertaking was the question of what was meant by the Negroes. What was, because like, for instance, the word zanj or zanji in the Arabic language. The lexicographers, right? English, Arabic lexicographers, when they translate the word zanj, they all translate as Negro. And I was a bit suspicious about, okay, well, it seemed to me that the Negro is something a little bit more than what we simply call Black person. Because earlier we were talking about the issue of how Black is a sort of a racial stratification, and then it has certain assumptions attached to it, certain cultural assumptions attached to it, sometimes biological assumptions attached to it. And I was trying to understand, okay, well, why does this term seem to be so negative? Does it have such a negative connotation? Right? And it appeared to me, after reading quite a bit, that the early Arabs, that they didn't classify all the Blacks in the same way. So, for instance, if you were to look at, there's a book that was written, I believe it's in the 4th century of Islam. It's called Hudud al-Alam, right? The author is unknown, but it definitely was a book that was written during that time. We know that it was actually authentic from that period, right? And in that particular book, the individual who writes the book apparently was a traveler. And similar to like Ibn Battuta, or Mas'udi as well, they would go to the different areas of the world and then they would describe what they saw, the people that they saw. So the author says that, okay, he visited this land of the Zanj. And what he noticed about the Zanj is that there are people there, first and foremost, they're cannibals. Right? They're cannibals. Said they're naked, right? They have no clothes. They said, and there are no Muslims who live there, right? No Muslims living there. Then he talked about a place north of the Zanj. Right? And so the Zanj is sort of like the sub-equatorial people. They're sub-Saharan, sub-equatorial people. He goes up a little bit further to the north to a people they call the Zabij. Now, he talks about the Zabij. You say, okay, the Zabij people, they're half clothes. And there are some Muslims who actually live there. In other words, he's suggesting that, okay, the reason why they have some clothes, is because the Muslims are there, right? But then he goes to Abyssinia, the Habasha. And he has very positive things about the people of Abyssinia. He said, they're very attractive people. They're brown, dark brown people. They're very attractive people. They're well clothed. They are very, very cultured, I guess you would say. And they have relationships with Bahrain and this country and that country. A lot of Muslims who live there, right? So everything is suggesting that, okay, the reason they're more civilized is because the Muslims made it to these areas. And the areas of the world where the Muslims didn't reach, they were less civilized. I don't know if that was true, right? But this is what he's describing. Mas'udi in his books is similar, right? Similar claims he makes about, the Zanj, and he even goes as far as claiming that some of them, they sharpen their teeth to look like animals and things like that. So this is, you find this type of descriptions, and they're talking about the Zanj, the Negro. And so all of these scholars, what we knew, similar to Ibn Khaldun, is that they were they were climate theorists, right? In other words, they believed that that the most civilized, the most beautiful, the most cultured people on the planet were the people of the Mediterranean, right? And the belief is that, okay, the further out you went from the Mediterranean, the less civilized you became, right? They believe that. So which really explains, okay, well, why, so every time he goes up further north, and he's getting closer to the Mediterranean, then this itself sort of explains, okay, why these people are described as being more civilized, or again, more clothing, etc., more attractive. And so in other words, because the belief is, okay, the Mediterranean, they're the most beautiful people. They're the most, enlightened people, right? So this was something that they all held in common, right? So this was something that that I tried to look into, and I was able to find that there is definitely a distinction being made between them, right? There's a historian by the name of John G. Jackson who had the following to say. He said that in the literature on Africa, Africans are commonly identified in two groups, one progressive, the other backward. Progressive peoples are called Hamites, Cushites, Moors, etc., whereas the backward ones are called Negroes. He further says the word Negro was manufactured during the Atlantic slave trade. Or to put it another way, there are many species of small fish in the ocean. When put into cans, they're called sardines. There are no free fish called sardines. They only get that name when canned. No free Africans were called Negroes. They got that name only after being enslaved. A fish becomes a sardine when imprisoned in the can, and Africans became Negroes when they were put in chains. Right. So he himself is he's somewhat of an Egyptologist, and he's sort of Pan-Africanist, right? And so this is the sort of thing he had to say about this. So I was really happy to see, okay, well, there's these parallels, and so the point being that not so much that it's a good thing that when negative things are attributed to Blacks, that it was a specific type of Black that we're talking about, but more so that the discovery of a type of diversity, among the Blacks, and the lack of homogeneity existed and was acknowledged by people in the past, and that the reason that the Negro was considered on the bottom had far less to do with the color of their skin, but it had much more to do with their lack of civilization, right? Again, because if you're eating your own kind, if you're not wearing any clothing, et cetera, or constantly at war with one another or other people around you, that in itself was taken as being a sign or a lack of civilization. This hadith is also instructive, right? So, the first of those to make their Islam public were 7 people. The Messenger of God, Abu Bakr, Ammar, and his mother Sumayya, Suhaib and Bilal, and Miqdad ibn Amr. So these, and there's another narration which replaces Miqdad with a man known as Khabbab ibn Arat. فأما رسول الله فمنعه الله بعمه أبي طالب. As for the Prophet, Allah protected him through his uncle Abu Talib. وأما أبو بكر فمنعه الله بقومه. As for Abu Bakr, Allah protected him with his people. وأما زائرهم فأخذهم المشركون وألبسوهم أدراء الحديث وصهروهم في الشمس. As for the rest of them, the mushrikun, they took hold of them and they dressed them in plates of metal, and they tried to melt them in the sun. In other words, they place them in the sun they heats up that iron and hopes to get them to reject Islam. فما منهم إنسان إلا وقد واتاهم على ما أرادوا إلا بلال. Said, and not a single one of them, there wasn't a single one of them except that they conformed or complied with the demands of the mushrikeen, except for Bilal. فإنه هانت عليه نفسه في الله. Because for him, his soul was insignificant of a loss in the way of God. Right? In other words, when he's here striving in God's way, for him it's like, oh, this okay. This is my body, right? وَهَانَ عَلَىٰ قَوْمِهِ, and his own people, of course, they themselves, they deemed him insignificant as well. فأعطوه البلدان فأخذوا يطوفون به في شعاب مكة وهو يقول أحد أحد. So they gave Bilal to the children and the slaves, and they took him and dragged them around the small streets of Mecca, and while Bilal is repeating over and over Ahad, 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 right? So but again, the point here is that, okay, well, Ammar bin Yasir was an Arab. Suhaib was an Arab. Miqdad ibn Amr was an Arab, but they were still persecuted. Khabbab ibn Arat, who was in the other narration, was an Arab, still persecuted. Why were they persecuted? Because they were outsiders, because they were former slaves. Because they're Arab slaves. Suhaib, we just heard about Suhaib. He was taken into captivity. Zayd ibn Haritha, he was kidnapped as a little boy. That's how he became the Prophet's adopted son, right? Later on. So the raids were normal. They're quite normal in Arabia. They raid a town, raid a village, take someone, he's now a slave. But when that person becomes free, is a problem. And so that that itself leads to an issue in terms of social status, social mobility. And this could explain why the marriage between Zayd ibn Haritha and Zainab bin Jahsh didn't work out. Zainab bin Jahsh, she's the Prophet's cousin, alayhi salam, and so she's like a noble woman. And she marries who? Zayd ibn Haritha. Who's he? He's a former slave, right? Right. So a cultural difference. Both of them are Arabs. They're both Arabs, They don't get along. Something's not working, so eventually they divorce. I think that could be a good way to explain this. And this is what happens. It's a class issue. Now, our current attitudes about race, I would say, have been influenced largely by 4 European thinkers from the Enlightenment period, which was the end of the Enlightenment. So here, one is a man, his name is Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus is considered to be, they call him the father of taxonomy, or the father of racial taxonomy. Well, he was the very first person to apply the Greek predicables to the human race. In other words, try to classify us into genus, species, difference, those things like that. So Linnaeus, which is said to have been done as just a matter of convenience, decided to classify the human race into 4 different categories based upon color. It was black, white, red, and yellow. So there are 4 races. And I'm going to show you something a little bit later, inshallah, in a minute as well, right? Now, after him, there's this man. So Linnaeus was from Sweden. He was Swedish botanist. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, he took a lot of the same ideas of Linnaeus after him. He's German. And he added the brown race. So 5 races. Right? So most people today go, how many races are there? I have 5. There's the red, there's the black, there's the white, there's yellow, there's the brown, at least in the West. Right? People have 5 races. This is the influence of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach. Now, if you read the writings of Charles Darwin and others similar to him, they talk about it, they make it clear and say, well, there was no agreement upon the number of races that there are. Some had it all the way up to 67 different types of races. There's 67 races. So, but it's like, okay, well, there's just 4. There's just 5 of them. Arthur de Gobineau is a Frenchman. He's an aristocrat. He's actually the author of what we call the Aryan master race theory. Right? The Aryan master race theory. So in other words, that the Aryan race, right, is the original man, right? And so everything else is a degenerative version, right, of the Aryan master race. So he goes on to say that in his book, The Inequality of the Human Races, he says that that if there's any civilization on Earth, or anytime there is a civilization, in other words, a civilization, a particular group of people are actually able to impose their culture upon other people, it has everything to do with some type of admixture of Aryan blood, right? So his observation was that, okay, well, in the absence of Aryan blood, you don't see the spread of a particular civilization. So we have these ideas, So, but then we add Charles Darwin. I think a lot of people don't often, and this is my own sort of contribution here in terms of Charles Darwin. See, Darwin's in the 19th century as well, like Gobineau, and Blumenbach is on the sort of halfway through the 19th century. Charles Darwin, when he introduces his theory of evolution, this now brings an additional sort of element to ideas of race, because if we can go back to Linnaeus, people say, well, Linnaeus he wasn't really talking about, okay, you start off as like a pure blood and then you become, you understand, adulterated. He's like, okay, I'm just convenient categories. But Darwin introduces the idea of evolution or devolution as well. So Linnaeus, let's start with Linnaeus. Then we work our way up to Darwin. I want to share a quote from Darwin. So this is Linnaean's layout. So these are the colors themselves correspond to, we call the 4 humors, right? So blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, right? So if a person has the right balance of blood, then you're sanguine, meaning you're cheerful. If you phlegmatic, you have phlegm, too much phlegm, you become phlegmatic, sluggish, another way of saying lazy. If you're choleric, like you're hot-tempered, right? You're prone to anger. Like it's the way that we Americans used to describe the Native Americans, the Indians, we call them, when I was growing up. And then if you're melancholy, you have too much black bile, then you're melancholic, you become like a sad, So that's how they refer to the Chinese. Chinese were sad people. That's why they don't smile that much, The Chinese they're melancholy. So he also, he takes it this far. So he talks about, okay, well, not only can we identify people by color, but and color and humor, but also we can know, you can talk about their posture, their behavior patterns as well. And we can talk about their motivations, right? So, for instance, the American, you're talking about here, the Native American, the Indian, the indigenous people to these lands. He says, these people are red, right? their color, you could describe the color of their skin, and they're choleric, right? They said they walk upright. See, they're ruled by habit. They're ruled by habit, you know. So in other words, it's not like they don't think. It's just habit. You know, they're not really thinkers, right? You know, why you keep doing it? It's just a habit. I'm just so used to doing it. I just, you know, it's like I'm addicted. I can't really, you know, I just act based on habit, right? You know, so you can see like there's a racial element, a racist element to his classification too. Because there's some people try to defend him and say, okay, it was innocent. Well, I'm not totally sure about that. If it was really innocent, right? When you're saying this, that we can make these assumptions about the person. The European, on the other hand, is white and sanguine. Sanguine is a good. He's cheerful, right? You know, he's muscular, right? And so the Native American he's upright, you know, but the European is muscular, right? You know, so that's very positive, and he's ruled by custom. So habit is a step above custom, right? Because it's not like custom. You know, there's like a philosophical sort of and rational sort of underpinning or sort of something that's there, you know. So we really thought this thing through, right? We have custom, you know, and we observe custom, we cherish custom, right? Because we're rational people. The Asian, he said they're pale yellow. We're talking about sort of like the Chinese. We're talking about they're pale yellow. They're melancholy and they're stiff. You know, they're ruled by belief, right? So the natives habit, you know, the Asians by belief, right? Superstition. There's another way to superstition, right? So unproven, irrational type of things, right? And then come to the African. So, okay, the blacks, you know, they're phlegmatic, they're relaxed. A little fancy way of saying they're lazy. Oh, there's again, phlegmatic. So they're ruled by caprice. Which basically is like, it's really, you're just this one step up from the animals. In other words, caprice meaning that your appetite. You see something you want and you're hungry, you get it. Right? You know, it's like you're thirsty, you go after it, you just jump, you pounce something. You understand? So it's a step above the animal, like predatory animals, right? So this is, again, these are things that we have been indoctrinated in for centuries, to be totally honest. And I would say even today that we still suffer from this, and until we actually take this head on, then we're going to continue to have a lot of big problems, right, with one another. So I mentioned, so Blumenbach added the brown race. That was really the main difference between him and Linnaeus. But here's so this is Gobineau, again, the Aryan master race guy. So this is what he says. He's like talking about the Negroids, the Negroid variety. The Negroid variety is the lowest. It stands at the foot of the ladder. The animal character that appears in the shape of the pelvis is stamped on the Negro from birth and foreshadows his destiny. So in other words, you know, the pelvis, right? You know, so stereotypes about the big, you know, that's really where he's coming from. It's like animals have, you know, big pelvis, and the Negroes have big pelvis too, right? Look like those, like a horse and things like that. So he says, his intellect will always move within a very narrow circle. He is not, however, a mere brute. You know, he's not like an ape. He's not an ape. He's above the ape, right? You know, he's not a mere brute. For behind his low receding brow, in the middle of his skull, we can see signs of a powerful energy, however crude his objects. If his mental faculties are dull or even non-existent, he often has an intensity of a desire and so of will, which may be called terrible. Many of his senses, especially taste and smell, are developed to an extent unknown to the other two races. Because for him it was the black, white, and yellow. The very strength of his sensations is the most striking proof of his inferiority. In other words, because he's acting from caprice. It's like your emotions, your desires, right? Let's come to Charles Darwin. So we're familiar with Origin of Species, his most popular book. He has another book called Descent of Man. It's Charles Darwin, right? So to see the racism from him as well. So he said, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of as at present between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So close the gorilla is like, but the whites are, way ahead. So this is Charles Darwin. Man. So it's pseudoscience. So the pseudoscience gets mixed with real science. And so this is sort of what comes. And of course, this is not just to dump on Darwin and say, okay, we shouldn't read Darwin. No, you can read Darwin, but it's just to understand that people still are flawed. Now, a final question I want to deal with is this. This is a question of whether or not it is considered sacrilege to call the Prophet ﷺ black. This is Imam Nawawi, the great scholar of the Shafi'i school, who says, if one were to say that the Prophet, God's blessing and peace be upon him, was black, or he died before growing a beard, or said, he is not Qurayshi, it would be kufr, because describing him contrary to his proper description is to negate and belie him. The kufr, call the Prophet black, kufr, you're a kafir, you call the Prophet black. Now I'm going to read you a different quote. Now this is a quote from a scholar from a bit closer from our own time, so he's the 19th century Muhammad Arafat Dasuqi is a Maliki scholar from Egypt, an Azhari. And he says this, he says, apostasy, actually this is from Sheikh Dardir. He's actually, this is from the commentary of Dasuqi, but this is from another scholar known as Imam Dardir. So apostasy also results if one curses him, meaning he curses the Prophet, or finds fault with him, that is, ascribes him to a flaw. A flaw is the opposite of something agreeable, as espoused by the revealed law or custom. Equally, if it relates to his physical appearance, like saying that he is black or one-eyed, or if it relates to his conduct, like saying that he is an imbecile, a coward, or stingy, or if it pertains to his commitment to faith, like saying that he is of little piety, one who forsakes prayer, or denies payment of the obligatory alms, zakat. Now, I wanted to just highlight a distinction between Imam Dardir and Imam Nawawi here. So Imam Dardir is saying here, so he says that a flaw is the opposite of something agreeable, mustahsan, as espoused by the revealed law, or custom, equally if it relates to his physical appearance, like saying he is black. So in other words, to say that for the Prophet to be called black is itself aib. That itself is, because blackness itself is a flaw. Imam Nawawi, on the other hand, we go back to his statement, he says, oh, the reason why this is kufr is because it describes him contrary to his proper description. And it's to negate, it is to negate and belie him. In other words, if we know that the Prophet ﷺ was not black, and we all know that, right? Then that would be to describe him in a way contrary to the way he is. Imam Nawawi doesn't say, okay, well, the reason is why it's kufr is because blackness is something bad. Whereas Imam Dardir is basically saying blackness is something bad, right? And so you can find this pretty common, because I have a special chapter in my book related to blackness in the Maliki school, right? Among these, and I look a very close look at many of these scholars, popular scholars in the Maliki school, in particular towards 18th, 19th century, right? Who we might assume were influenced by the West, but maybe not at the same time, and so I didn't really come to any firm conclusion on that it was originated simply from the West. But I do think there's an important distinction to highlight, is that for Imam Nawawi, it was that, okay, it's kufr because that's not the way that the Prophet ﷺ was. We know for a fact that that's not what he was. But the other scholars say, well, blackness, because if to call him black is to call him something that's negative, something disparaging, right? And that in itself would be very problematic. If it's disparaging, then it's disparaging for Bilal to be black. It's disparaging for Ali ibn Abi Talib or Abu Dhar or Ammar ibn Yasir or any other Sahabi who was described to be who was black, right? Or is described as black. So that in itself is a fundamental problem. Now, despite that, I would say this: that while I disagree with Imam al-Dardir's characterization, that I do believe that Muslims have an obligation to avoid calling the Prophet both black and white. I think to even say the Prophet was white is also disparaging, right? It can be disparaging. Why? Because the early Arabs, they considered calling someone white to be disparaging, right? Unless it was a reflection upon their character, right? Because this is what the lexicographers teach us, that, Ibn Manzur from Lisan al-Arab and others, that this is, the Ta'libi, others, they just say they're all the same thing. But I would say more so because of the loaded nature of these terms in our time. They're very loaded, right? Because if you say the Prophet was white, people think, oh, the Prophet was European. But the Prophet was not European. Right? And even if we say, well, no, we know he wasn't European, but he looked like a European. Well, I don't know if he looked like a European. I don't think he did, because the Arabs themselves, again, who was white for the Arabs, right? The Europeans and the Shamis and the Persians, and you understand, those were the whites for the Arabs. So there's definitely a translational issue, and I think that we have to try our best to avoid becoming too wrapped up in we call the culture wars, right? And so it would probably be better to avoid utilizing those type of terms to describe the Messenger of Islam, especially with the fact that, considering the fact that there are many Muslims who really get worked up about this. Why is it okay to say the Prophet's white, but it's not okay to say he's black? Well, we shouldn't say he's white either. Right? Okay, all right, no problem. We got to say he's black. We're also not going to say he's white either, right? So, and if Imam al-Dhahabi is correct, we'll say he's wheat colored. He was wheat colored because Abyad Hanfi alone. He said, well, that's what it means if you're going to refer to the skin color, right? So anyway, I hope there's some benefit from that. I hope I didn't go over time as well, but may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you, and really thank you once again for inviting me here for this talk. So.
Thank you very much for attending tonight. I hope in the future we are going to host you again.
Inshallah.
Now we will continue with Isha prayer.
Inshallah. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much for everybody for attending.
Any questions are here? Sure. I mean, I'm fine. Okay.
Any questions?
Yes.
Thank you very much for coming, and this was very informative. I didn't know any of much about this details about the Arabic language at the time. But I remember one story when you were talking about Sierra. I think, I'm not sure if this was authentic, but this should be in Medina times, I think. One Sahaba gets upset with Bilal radiallahu anhu and calls him son of the black
woman, right?
Yes. And he goes to Rasulullah, he says, Ya Rasulullah, is it my fault that my skin is black? And Rasulullah says, whoever said this to you, he has Jahiliyyah inside him.
Right.
So then other Sahaba comes and says, the story, rest of the story.
Right.
So from that, I feel like, again, he was saying this because of his skin color. So how we should understand this?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually. Yeah, thank you. The narration it states that Abu Dhar al-Ghifari radiallahu anhu was the one who said this to Bilal. And apparently they had some sort of debate about military strategy, and Bilal started to suggest things, and Abu Dhar took issue with it and said, well, who are you to tell me how to sort of conduct a war, right? So, and then he supposedly said this to him, Yadna Soda, son of a black woman. Now, this particular story is related by Imam al-Bayhaqi and a couple other collectors of hadith, and the ulama are, from what I've seen, are in agreement that this hadith, this version of the account, actually is very weak. Where actually says he refers to Ibn Soda. But in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, you do find a story about Abu Dhar. It mentions him by name, and it doesn't mention who this individual is. Right? And actually, one story actually says that one of his own slaves, he had some very negative things to say about the mother of one of his own slaves. It doesn't say exactly what it says. It doesn't say what Abu Dhar said to him. And then when the Prophet ﷺ heard about it, he says, Ya Abu Dhar, anta rajulun fika jahiliya, that you're a man who has some jahiliya in you, right? And so after this, it said that the Prophet ﷺ, he told him, I said, these are your brothers in faith, so you are to that you are to dress them with the same attire that you wear, you should feed them from the same food. And they said after that, Abu Dhar, was never seen without his slave, or anytime he was seen with that slave, people wouldn't know the difference between the owner and the one who's owned because they wore the same thing. So he had a toba that he had done. So according to this version of account, and this is considered to be the more authentic version of accounts, it doesn't appear to be Bilal. It appears to be someone else, some of his own slaves, right? Where this is the situation where he makes statements about. I've always found it strange, that particular narration, that he says, so that Abu Dhar himself was black. He was black skinned himself, right? So why would he refer to Bilal as Ibn Soda when his own, he also has black skin? According to his description, you look up his description. Ibn Athir, it's like in Ustul Ghaba and others, when they describe Abu Dhar, describe him as similar to the color of Bilal himself. It's really strange, right? And even if he wasn't the same color, there are also, again, the narrations of Ammar and Yasser. Right? So isn't he offending Ammar as well? Isn't he offending all the other black Arabs, right, by saying Yabna Soda, right? So I would say that either this hadith is simply unreliable, or if we say, or we assume it to be sound, then there was some other reason other than the black skin that Abu Dhar utilized that particular terminology. He might have said Soda, but he meant something else, that Soda in the sense of she was a slave or something like that. That's the only way I can see reconciling it with the sounder versions of that particular report. But it appears to me that it's not a reliable report, reliable enough to actually fit everything we know about the state of the Arabs. As I mentioned before, that most of the Arabs were light and dark brown, right? And everyone, you can, Ibn Jawzi, he has a section in his book where he lists the Sahaba who actually were children of Ethiopian women. One of them he lists is Umar ibn Khattab. He actually puts Ibn Khattab among them. Like their mother was Ethiopian. So wouldn't Abu Dhar also be offending Umar ibn Khattab if you say Ibn Soda, right? If it meant exactly that. Yeah. So there's just so many different things to consider when we hear these stories and repeat them. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious about the words we don't use and which are kids that don't use, or like N-word.
Right.
Is this the same sort of origin to explain about the word negro? Is this different pronunciation of the N-word.
Yeah.
Second,
Mhm.
what's the, like, is it or by time it changed the meaning?
Mhm.
And at the same time on TV or
Mhm.
black people, they between each other, they use that word.
Mhm.
What's the origin of that and why
Right.
we don't use, because we call, it's insulting or it's a
Right.
like crime.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if you can tell me more about that.
Right. Yeah. Inshallah. Okay. Yeah. The N word, what we call the N word, that it's fairly obvious that slave owners in the Americas, that they were referring to these slaves as being people coming from areas in Africa like Nigeria or Niger, right? Just they had their own special pronouncement of the word. Now, Negro, we know is in Spanish and Portuguese that, it just means black, but it's a color itself, so that became common, right? But it was a derogatory, the N word we call it was a derogatory, basically to refer to someone who's uncivilized, savage, an ignorant person with who was unclean, et cetera, those type of things. So in that sense, of course, it is a slur. Right? It's been used like a slur that way. Unfortunately, so many black people themselves, they use it to refer to one another, right? But white people are not allowed to use it, even though it just has this very negative connotation, or people say, well, no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying Nigga. I'm not saying Nigger, thinking this shaitan tricks you into believing that this is the difference between the two, right? So, okay, well, so why can my white person say, well, I'm saying Nigga too, right? But you can't even say that one, right? So if it's supposed to be so different. But apparently that's where it originates. I mean, Negro has had a very dark history. As a matter of fact, I went to the UK some years ago to promote my book, and so they actually had I had a live radio, like 10-minute interview on the radio when I was there, and I actually found it strange that the host, he when he introduced the book, he says that I'm gonna use a word, which is not very good here in the UK. I'm only gonna say it once, but it's the title of the book. And it says the Negro in Arab Muslim consciousness. And so I said, well, I was really shocked. I didn't realize that even Negro in the UK is a derogatory term, right? It's really surprised me. So it made me think, if I reprint my book, I'm gonna maybe have to change the title so I can sell more copies in the UK, right? So, but it's really interesting, how that sort of works, like culturally, and yeah. So, all people, I guess you say, have derogatory things that they say about other people, but as the Prophet ﷺ said that, "Kullukum min Adam, wa khalaqa Allahu Adam min tarab." All of you are from Adam, and Allah created Adam from dirt. So that's all we are, dirt, or we're, a sperm drop. All these things, we come from. We're nothing, right? We think we're so much, but Allah has made it a test. This sort of shell, this skin that we all live in. Is this remove the skin, we're all the same color, right? But it's part of the test that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives all of us. The yabluwakum ayyukum ahsanu amala, right? To see who will act the best, who will exhibit the best conduct, right? And morals, right? So that's really ultimately, in akramakum indallahi atqakum, right? Those who have the most taqwa are those who are most noble in the sight of God. Anything else? Okay. Oh, it's a heroin.
Thank you so much for the talk. I just had a quick question about the last part of the talk, and maybe this slides.
Yeah.
So, in terms of how we address the Prophet, does that mean that making any kind of mistake in terms of describing him, how he was physically or any kind of action would be true disbelief? Is that it?
Well, according to Imam al-Dardir and many who agree with him, then yes, it would entail that if you describe the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam as being black or anything that people would consider to be disparaging, then that would be kufr, right? Imam al-Nawawi's focus, I mentioned before, is on the authenticity of the description itself. So if we already know the tawatur, right, that this diffuse information, that the Prophet ﷺ looked a certain way, and then we describe them as looking a different way, then he says, well, yeah, that would be kufr, because you are not describing Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? So Rasulullah, we have so much information about him that we know that this is what he looked like. And I mean, what's easy is the easiest thing to do, the simplest thing to do. The Prophet was Arab, okay. Prophet was an Arab, and that's it. Stop there. No need to focus on obsess about his color. No, but of course, it's okay to mention that the Arabs, most of them were brown, light and dark brown, right? Yeah, but it's just the question of now we're going to place them in some particular box, right? Some racial box, and we have to understand that racial categories. And one of the things I'm trying to demonstrate is that racial classification is very subjective. How many races actually exist, right? Is it 4? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 17? Is it 30? Is it 50? Is it 100? How many racial categories actually do exist, right? And are those racial categories determined by color alone, right? Because it's very clear that if you go to Africa, that everyone who looks the same doesn't consider the other person one of their own, right? You understand? So Ethiopians, they don't consider the Somalis to be their, you understand? Or the Eritreans. They're not, you understand? So they're not, no, they're not our brothers, right? People, they speak different languages. They have different religions. They have different cultural sensibilities, right? Same thing, I mean, the Wolof and the Mandinka, and no, we're not the same. And people may see us saying, hey, you look just like him. Hey, no, we're not. No, we're not. We don't think the same. We don't believe the same things. Right? So you definitely can't determine a race on the basis of appearances. Right? And that's really just the fundamental point. And so there's a constructivist aspect to racial categories. It's very subjective, and it's not real science, right? To talk about the race, this race or that race. Now, one caveat I would say is that race as a sociological phenomenon is completely real. And what I mean by that is, if we see race as the collective identity developed by a people vis-a-vis their experience with another group of people, then sure, it's completely real. Sociologically, it's very real. Black people in America, those, again, the descendants of African slaves and who have a history here in this country, as a sociological or cultural race is real in the sense of we all imbibe the same history and we internalize those experiences and they've been passed down, you understand, in a certain way that we look at white people. And there's a certain way that white people look at Black people, or you understand, and Turks maybe with Kurdish people. I don't know you understand. So in that sense it's real, but biologically there's not really much difference between one person and another, right? Biologically, same number of chromosomes, right? Human beings, But of course, we have these different, colors, hair texture, lip, size, etc. Those type of things. So it's a test for all of us, and so hopefully that helps.
Thank you very much.